Hi, everybody. It's Monday morning lectionary time again. And so we're glad to be with you and hope that this is helpful for the week.
Yep. Our story today is from Matthew 15. This is kind of a long story. It's actually sort of feels like it's two stories in one. But anyway, let's hear it, Tom.
All right. Jesus called the crowd to him and said to them, "Listen and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth of a person that defiles, but it is what comes out of the mouth that defiles." And some of the disciples said to him, "Teacher, do you know that the Pharisees were offended, took offense at what they heard you say?" And he said, "Whatever has not been planted by my heavenly Father will be uprooted. Let them alone. Blind guides blind. A blind person leads another blind, they'll both fall into a pit." And Peter said to him, "Lord, explain to us this parable." And Jesus said to him, "Are you still without understanding? Do you not see that what goes into the mouth proceeds to the stomach and then goes out into the sewer? But what defiles is what comes out of the mouth, which proceeds from the heart. That's what defiles. For out of the heart come evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. These come out of the heart, and they are what defile. But washing with unwashed hands, eating with unwashed hands, that does not defile." So he arose from there and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And a Canaanite woman from that region came out and she started shouting at him, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David, for my daughter is tormented by a demon." And he wouldn't have anything to do with her. And the disciples said to him, "Master, send this woman away, for she keeps coming after us and shouting at us." And he said, "I have been sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." But she knelt before him and said, "Lord, please help me." And Jesus said, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord. But even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done as you wish." And immediately her daughter was healed.
All right.
Oh, there's a story.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let's talk about it. The first part, I mean, Jesus is talking to the crowd, I guess, and then to his disciples because they don't get it. He's talking about things that are defiled, and then he's talking about plants being uprooted and blind guides. So it feels like, well, first of all, why is he talking about things that are being defiled, or what defiles actually? And also then what's the conflict about? It seems like there's quite a bit of conflict going on.
Well, this part of Matthew, this speech follows a dispute between Jesus and the Pharisees when they criticize him for permitting his disciples to eat with hands unwashed. And so they have a very sharp interchange about that. And so this then continues that discourse, that discussion, that argument. This is a rabbinic about what defiles, about the purity laws. And the Pharisees had as a normative position that there were a whole series of things that defile a person by eating unclean foods. And so there was a major focus on that as something that makes a person impure, unclean, if they eat unclean foods. That's reflected in the story of Peter and the sheet in Acts of Cornelius, that all these things come down, and the Lord says to Peter, Peter, arise, kill and eat. And Peter says, Lord, nothing impure or profane has ever touched my lips. So this was a primary focus of piety, of doing what is right, and of not being made unclean by eating unclean foods. Jesus rejects that whole position and instead focuses on what comes out of the heart. And that's where he sees then the things that defile, that make them unclean, that are sins that make a person unclean. So we're quite familiar with those kind of legal issues becoming points of major conflict. It's happening in relation to sexual identity and relation to various foods that are still declared unclean in Islam and in Orthodox Judaism. So these things are quite familiar in terms of the level of conflict.
Yeah, it makes me think of Richard Rohr's kind of theme this week. I get these, as you know, I get these daily emails from the Center for Action and Contemplation. And a lot of them are written by Richard Rohr, excuse me, and his theme now for the next 3 weeks is order, disorder, and reorder. So this week he's talking about order, and he's talking about the importance of having order in our lives as kind of a ground, something we can count on, and that laws create, religious laws and other frameworks create boundaries or things that we can count on. So that sort of helped me understand why these cleanliness laws that Jesus is talking about are so important. It seems a little silly to us, I guess, but it clearly was really important to them. I mean, do you think that makes sense, that it created a kind of order for them that people could count on? And
oh yes, that was, the Pharisees were pious. They were religious. They observed things and they cared about doing what was right. And so their passion around the prohibition of unclean foods and of unwashed hands that then defile the food before it's eaten. That's a characteristic way of maintaining boundaries between unclean persons, Gentiles, who don't observe cleanliness laws, and Jews who do.
Yeah, so there's a way in which Jesus was extending those boundaries.
He's creating different boundaries.
Different boundaries, right? Yeah. Let's get back to the eating with unwashed hands. Jesus says that does not defile. What does he mean by that?
Well, he does not support all of the legal traditions in regard to unclean foods, unclean hands. He declared all foods unclean. That's why the followers will eat shellfish, shrimp and scallops and other things that are regarded, and pork, which are regarded as unclean foods in the traditions of the conservatives in the traditions of Israel. Reformed Jews do often eat those foods, but Jesus places the focus not on food or what one eats, but rather the spirit, on what comes out of the heart.
Okay, good. All right, let's move on to this second story. But I'm wondering if there's a connection between the first kind of conflict story or around defilement and cleanliness, and then this next story, which seems very different. It's a story. Jesus goes off and has this encounter with this Canaanite woman. Is there a connection between the two, or is it just?
Sure, it's the connection of boundaries. So Jesus, even in going to Tyre and Sidon, is crossing a boundary into Gentile territory. But then when she comes after him and starts shouting and asking for him to heal her daughter, this is calling for a degree of relationship, and that would make him unclean. And so in what would be called a good rabbinic protection against uncleanness, he won't have anything to do with her initially, and then says, I've been sent to the lost sheep of Israel, which means not to the Gentiles, and specifically not to you. And when she begs him, then he first responds by saying, it isn't fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs.
Okay, let me ask you about that. So
okay.
It seems like Jesus is pretty harsh with her.
Very.
Yeah. Now, I do know that your answer to this question because of all the work we've done with the story in Mark with his encounter with a Syrophoenician woman. So I'm going to ask you to keep it kind of brief. But why is Jesus so harsh with this woman and calls her people dogs and all of that? What's behind that?
Well, he is observing, acting as a good Jew, and that was also the case then, especially in his time, say around 80, 85 AD, after the Jewish-Roman War, when the degree of hostility between Jews and Gentiles, specifically Jews and Romans, was highly intense. And so this is his being tough-minded. So he's not a wishy-washy liberal in relation to this. He recognizes what this is, and it is really a big deal for him to have any relationship with this woman at all.
Okay.
He's doing something for his enemy.
Yeah.
And So that's the encounter. That's what's on the other side of these boundaries.
Yeah.
It was only 15, 20 years ago, it was a war.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, at the end, actually, I mean, he does this major turnaround and says that she has great faith. In what sense does she exhibit great faith?
Well, she shouting and she keeps persisting, like the widow and the judge parable. She is persistent and is willing to take abuse from first the disciples who are trying to send her away, and then from Jesus, have nothing to do with her initially, and then says these things that opt her out, but she continues to persist. Yeah. And that's a definition of faith.
Yeah, right.
Her confidence.
Yeah. Does this story have particular meaning for us today that comes to mind?
I think it's a direct example of what Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies and do good for those who persecute you. So the Syrophoenicians, the Canaanites had persecuted Israelites for centuries. So he is acting out his basic teaching, which is love your enemies, do good for them. And this is both an example of that, but it's also his direct response to this woman who is clearly quite insistent and not what you would call, she's off-putting. She's a woman who keeps shouting, but then he in the end regards that as faith and as then a basis for his doing an act of love and of doing good for her. So what is happening in many parts of the world right now is that people are basing warfare, conflict, intense hatred in relation to the boundaries, national boundaries. We're doing that in the United States. And of heightening hostility. What Jesus was doing was lessening hostility, bringing love, relationship across those boundaries. So you could call this a story about boundary crossing for us, that we are called as followers of Jesus to cross those boundaries between people.
It's not only boundaries across ethnic divides, cultural divides, but also gender. So this is one of those stories,
right?
Aren't real common, but where there's an encounter between Jesus and a woman, and she's loud. I mean, she's aggressive. She's persistent, as you were saying. And even the disciples, they want to get her out of the way, which is even today, women who kind of persist in advocating for their rights or for their interests, get termed aggressive or mouthy. You hear that a lot.
Yep.
And instead, at the end, anyway, Jesus, well, first of all, he listens to her. He does listen to her, engage with her and talk to her. He doesn't just send her away like the male disciples want. But then he affirms her, as we said, calling her persistence, interpreting that as faith, as great faith. So that just occurred to me as you were talking about the boundaries.
Right.
All right. Well, we better sign off. Thanks everybody for watching.
Right.
Listening, and tell the story and enjoy.
Have a great week.
Bye.
Bye.